everybody. Feels so good to be back in Vilnius. Can you please do me a favor and show of hands if you have been part of this conference last year or the year before? Yeah, it's actually the majority, I would say. And I do remember some familiar faces and the discussions we had in the hallway last time. It's actually one of the favorite parts of my job, to talk to various communities and give their various perspectives back to GitHub HQ and then improve our product. And if you see some of the feedback from you realized in this talk today, then this is not a surprise. I'm, as I said, really glad to be here because it gives me a unique opportunity. The opportunity to convince you that the way we write code, basically the future of software, will be fundamentally different within the next 5 years. I believe we are currently in some kind of innovation jam. Many innovations just waiting to mature and break into the mainstream. Innovations in the area of machine learning on large open source data sets, but also innovations in the area of semantic and security code analysis, and innovations in the area of open source community research. And I like to talk about all of those innovations without sparing the more controversial parts, like you have seen in this teaser, was about job security. So I also like to give an outlook what kind of programming duties will still continue to exist in 5 years, and what part of duties will probably be automated away already. But before we talk about job security, you probably noticed on my accent already that I'm German. And as a German, a stereotypical German, I like to define terms up front. Right? And I talked about innovation so much. So what is an innovation? If you Google that term, you'll find typically the innovation onion from Horace Didier. And he's basically saying an innovation has to have 4 things. It has to be new, it has to be valuable, it has to be unique, and it has to be useful. And I don't disagree with that definition, but I think it's maybe too much to ask for all kind of different innovations. If something is useful and really valuable, does it really matter whether it's the first time you had this idea that it's really so unique? Because as Victor Hugo already said multiple centuries back actually, nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And I believe the first category of innovations is not so much about something completely new at the right time and in the right place, right? And to give you an example of what I mean by that, let's go back to the year of 2011, for instance, right? You have GitHub already existing for 3 years, and then there's some students who want to use GitHub and they see those open source projects, but they don't have any idea whether they even compile. I mean, there was all kind of source code online that would not even compile. And they thought, let's create a badge inside the README MDs, where if it's green, it actually compiles, and if it's red, then probably something is wrong with the tests. That was the first part of the idea. And the second brilliant part of the idea, not necessarily the first time they get to this one, was to have a YAML file, and you probably guessed it already at this point, a Travis YAML file where you could just tell how to compile and run your test. And 2011 was also the year where Jenkins and CircleCI joined them building stuff on GitHub. And at the beginning was just this badge, right? The green or yellow or red badge. Nowadays, you can provide all kind of metadata in your test runs. Like you see this Travis CI pull request here, where you have information about the stages which worked, you have information how long the test cases actually needed to run through, and you even have buttons to rerun certain test cases or to expose the build log. And I'm telling you that because this is the metadata we will do more machine learning on in the third category of innovations. Another interesting piece is if you analyze actually the amount of metadata stored within github.com in those 100 million repositories and correlate it to the CI systems which gave that feedback. You still have Travis CI with 50% of everything inside github.com from the metadata perspective, followed by Jenkins and CircleCI. So exactly those 3 companies who had the idea first, right, or at least at the right time and the right place, they still have the majority of the market here. And Travis CI and this 50% leads me to the second category of innovation, which is basically if you combine 2 disciplines together, right, 50%. This is actually the number of JavaScript libraries which had at least one security vulnerability in 2018. 50%. Actually, this is so shocking. I mean, it's easy. Created a complete slide just to. We're working on it. But this is good. You can look at. All right. Yeah. So 50%. Now this number really had time to sink in. Right? And you may ask why this is actually the case. Why are 50% vulnerable of all of those JavaScript libraries worldwide? And it basically has to do with all its dependencies. The average JavaScript library does not stand for itself, but it relies on many, many other libraries. Any idea how many in average, how many dependencies? Just shout it out, some guesses. 8, okay. 20,000, I heard. Well, this is actually the closest one. It's 742 dependencies in average. In average, not max, right? These are the numbers from Dependabot, and you see that JavaScript is not the only language which has so many indirect dependencies. It's directly followed by Ruby. And most of those dependencies have been known for years, right? This is not something new. This is a discipline which is well known, which is security alerts, and there's many, many tools, amazing tools in that category. But still, we had 50% vulnerable libraries in 2018. So we thought, what about if we told those maintainers, those project maintainers on github.com directly that they are depending on something that is vulnerable? And this is the security alerts we launched last year. And first we did that for JavaScript and Ruby, with Python following soon. And actually, in the first 2 weeks, 98% of those security alerts got remediated by the maintainers if the projects were still maintained, right? It's if they're still maintained. But still, this is huge percentage, right? Or to put it differently, 800,000 of those security issues have been resolved last year. And so we thought, okay, if this is working out so well, why not look at other languages as well? Like Java, for instance. The packages on Maven Central more than doubled last year, right? More, just in 1 year, the entire universe basically of Maven Central just doubled, and you had 27% more security vulnerabilities known to it. So this was a given then for us that we would include Java and also NuGet for .NET programmers. So now this is available on GitHub as well. And there's people who don't want to use GitHub, and that's fine. So as we are using most of the data from open source communities, you can also download all of those security alerts for your own project. So we made them open source. You can access them from an API. And if you're working with GitHub on your own servers, in your own data center with GitHub Enterprise Server, you also have access to that data. So this is about security and combining two different disciplines, like security alerting and the reach of the platform. But the majority of the talk I want to spend on the third category, but I just included that slide yesterday evening. So if you now push to GitHub, you will actually learn about all the security alerts you have in your project just from the command line. I thought this is pretty cool. But it's the last slide for the second category. Third one is about the majority of this talk, innovation that appears if you have a breakthrough in AI. And you have large data sets and you have machine learning on it, on structured data. And I do realize that's probably the most stereotypical blah blah bullshit you have heard so far, right? I mean, everybody is saying something like this. And you may ask, why now, right? I mean, machine learning is age old. Why does everybody now talks about this so much? Well, I try to give you an answer to that. If you're currently going through the Silicon Valley, you see billboard charts like this with something like the hen and egg problem. Which came first, right? The training data or the algorithms? And while there's probably no good answer for the original hen and egg problem, there actually is one in the data science. If you look at the major breakthroughs in machine learning, you will figure out that the algorithms are typically much, much older. Like in speech recognition, you already had the Markov models in 1984. But once there's a sufficiently large and qualitative data set available, in this moment you can actually have the major breakthroughs. So the difference between innovation and having the data set available is typically just 3 years on average. And this gives us hope to believe that there's actually something we can do with all the data on GitHub. If you look into data sets, they get so important nowadays that Google actually created a new data search engine just for data sets. If you enter security alerts into that dataset search engine, the first hit you get is this CVE database, the Common Vulnerability and Exposure database, and this is obviously part of also the data we use for our security alerts. But there's many more things we do, like we actually also monitor the communities. If, for instance, the JavaScript communities suddenly start to update their package.json files, or the Maven guys are updating their pom.xml files, we know something is going on and our algorithms detect that. The GitHub data set is actually about 500 terabytes of data across the 10 years of history. And I guess most of you probably directly associate all the commits with it. I mean, there's 1.5 billion commits every year in more than 100 million repositories. So every 1.6 seconds, a new repository gets created on GitHub. So since I'm talking with a short break, I guess it's already 600 created, 600 new repositories. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The most interesting data is actually in the pull request. Those more than 200 million pull requests from 31 million developers. Because there you do not only have the feedback from humans, whether code was good or bad, but you also have those CI checks you have seen at the beginning, right? Whether tests were running through, whether any security issues were found, whether test runtime increased after you did something like in Lotus talk when you updated a Docker image, that we could actually see that this has implication on the runtime and things like that. So we have reason to believe that this data will bring us a breakthrough. Problem is just what kind of breakthrough? And I like to have you guys show up hands again whether you ever heard about the South Park collecting underpants story. That's maybe 20%. Good. So for all who haven't heard about it, so in South Park, this cartoon, underpants are stolen from the kids. And the kids figure out it's small dwarfs, small underpant collecting gnomes who actually do that. And they follow those dwarfs right in their cave. And inside this cave, they just have a huge pile with all of those underpants. And they want to figure out why this is actually the case. And then they identify their business plan, right? Phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 3, profit. And nobody ever thought about phase 2, right? But it's okay, we just keep on collecting underpants. And this is often exactly the dilemma of many data source driven projects, right? You don't have an idea where you want to end up to, or at least you don't know how to get there. So you need a vision for phase 2 to make stuff work. And our previous CEO at GitHub Universe presented this vision as autonomous coding, right? So basically, robots should take care of the routine tasks while you're programming, and you can focus on what's important, on the creative stuff. And unfortunately, when he formulated the vision like this, many mainstream media thought, oh my God, GitHub actually wants to get rid of programmers. It's not a hello world, it's a goodbye world vision. So it's good that we have the opportunity to maybe explain a little bit more what this is about. And I have another question for you guys. Can you please show up hands if you have heard about willrobotstakemyjob.com, the website? 1. Okay. So on willrobotstakemyjob.com, you can enter your profession and it will tell you to which degree likelihood your job will be automated away in the next 5 years by robots. It's pretty scary, especially if you enter computer programmer. It says 48%. We should start worrying, and actually the field is shrinking. I thought, wait a moment, our field is not shrinking at all. And then I had a look at the fine print. And the fine print said that a computer programmer's job is to modify existing forms and tests according to specification from software developers. And that got my attention, so I entered software developers, and we're safe, right? We're totally safe, actually. In the moment, as your job is defined to collaborate with other people, to collaborate with your customers, to really solve problems, not just working on spreadsheets and solving problems that somebody else specified, then we're totally safe, and our field is actually increasing. Yes. So you can show, will robots take my job, to your boss, and you will still have an employment in 5 years. So the vision is actually not the Terminator-like one, where we want to get rid of all programmers. It's actually more to give you some intelligent suit, like in the Marvel universe, like today's screening about Captain Marvel. We like to be this intelligent suit for programmers. And for all of you who don't know or like Marvel, I have another metaphor. And now you basically get the idea why I'm wearing this leather jacket. I'm a new Knight Rider fan, right? And I was always dreaming of having such a car like Kit. And actually this car, I mean, most modern cars have what Kit had in the 80s and 70s, right? It has GPS, it has speech recognition. So in the car world, one could argue we are already there. And for programmers, we also just want to focus on what is important, and the automation around us should help us to focus on us and give us superpowers. And so far, it's just very, very abstract what those superpowers should actually be. So let's have a look into it. And we don't have to go into the future. We can just have a look at pull requests at GitHub nowadays. Like this is a pull request in a Facebook repository, and it involves the conversation of 2 robots and a human. Right, the first robot by AI finds out that certain code is unused, and he opens a pull request. And the first individual that answers is not a human, but the other robot. It's the bureaucratic Facebook robot. He says, "Thanks for your contribution, but first please sign the contributor license agreement." And this is paperwork you don't want to care about, right? You want to focus on what's important. So the 2 robots actually figure it out, and at the end, a human can review and merge that thing after the paperwork is out of the way. It actually turns out that humans are pretty open and positively responding to feedback from robots as long as it's constructive. Constructive doesn't mean 1000, oh, you might want to write the code like this, and this is a potential security problem, but really, this is how you fix it, this is how you click on this green button, and here you go. And based on the feedback on community discussions we had on this topic, we have a feature which is called suggested changes. With suggested changes, you no longer have to describe on GitHub how you want to have something changed. You don't say stuff like, I want to have this variable be called like this, and can't you do this and this and that, and you explain. Instead, you can just propose the change exactly like you want to see it, and the author of the pull request has to just click on this green button, and then it's in it. The commit belongs to the person who proposed the change, or the robot who proposed the change for that matter. And every 10th pull request or review in GitHub is already done via this suggested changes feature. We even want to go one step further in the life cycle. So in DevOps methodology, shifting left, this is the Atom IDE, and you see some SQL statement in it, right? And does anybody of you see a potential problem with that one? SQL injection, exactly. So what we want is that this SQL injection is underlined as if it was a syntax error. And 5 years from ago, if anybody told me about this vision, I thought, okay, this is marketing bullshit, right? I mean, we all went to university, and we had theoretic computer science, and we heard about the sentence of Rice and the holding problem, which basically says a computer cannot fully understand what another computer program is doing. Turns out you do not have to do that. If you have 200 million pull requests, there's a good chance that somebody else did already exactly the same programming error before. Maybe different variables, but the same structure, right? And our idea is to work with the data to figure out, as you type basically, whether you're going to commit a security problem or whether you're going to commit any kind of performance-related issues. So that's the future coming out in 5 years. And so far it was mostly about security, but there's other areas as well. And the next area is especially important and close to my heart because it involves my daughter. My daughter is 7 years old, and she painted this AutoCAD for my birthday. And she's a GitHub super fan, and she completely freaked out when she learned about myAutoCAD.com. It's the AutoCAD generator, right, where you can design your own AutoCAD. Hopefully I don't lose half my audience now by providing that link. But once she's seen that, she wanted to improve it. And she said, Daddy, I want to learn how to program. I was already proudly picturing her in university studying computer science, but statistically speaking, this is really, really unlikely. If you look at the UNESCO report, especially in Western Europe, only 20% of computer students are actually female, right? And there's some people who say maybe they're better tasked in other jobs. I think this is completely bullshit. I don't believe that it matters what I think or what they think. I go with the facts. And if you look, for instance, at economic studies from McKinsey, they clearly show that mixed teams have a way higher chance of creating above average results. So if you just not have a 100% male team, you probably will rock much more. So I believe it's not just crazy from a moral and ethical perspective that there's just so few women in computer science. Also from an economical perspective, I think we cannot only do it, we should do that. And I'm aware that this is a mostly structural society problem, right? It's nothing you can just solve by technology. But I want to give you some ideas how technology maybe can help to get more women into computer science. And I thought, let's start with the open source world. Maybe we can learn something out of the open source world. Turns out, in open source, the situation is even more devastating. Only 3% of active open source contributors identify as women. The only silver lining in this report is that it shows also the main reasons why it's so tough to get engaged in open source projects. The first reason typically mentioned is incomplete or confusing documentation. And all the reasons following are basically related to sometimes very toxic, rough communication tone. Turns out in the open source world, many people think because they are in front of a keyboard and they have an account name, they can behave like an asshole, right? There's no nice way around other than to say that. And more than 50% of all active open source contributors already witnessed incidents of rudeness, of name calling, of serious incidents like murder threats or stereotyping. And while males typically just in 16% of the cases say, that's it, don't want to be part of anymore, the amount of women who then just say, come on, this is my free time, right? This is my passion, I don't have to deal with that shit, is much, much higher. So some ideas how to at least address those concerns from a technical perspective, I like to show here. First one is Sentiment Bot. It's a bot based on the ProBot framework from GitHub, which is used in many communities. It basically looks into the conversations and it's using the Google Perspective API to figure out whether there's any toxic name calling stuff going on. You can even configure the threshold once this robot engages, right? Another bot which is more and more installed nowadays is the Welcome Bot. It turns out the first 2 weeks in an open source project for a newcomer matter the most. If you're new to open source and you've joined a project and open a pull request or an issue and you get some feedback in the first 2 weeks, it's twice as likely that you stay with the project. And the welcome bot makes sure that maintainers are, for instance, are aware that something has to be addressed, that somebody is new there. The biggest problem, however, stated in this open source survey was about the documentation. And this is not just how code works, it's also how you can contribute. If you are this kind of person that basically just throws your stuff over the fence and you don't really care whether they take it or not, then you're probably okay in open source nowadays. But if you want to be led by example or have a defined process, it's much harder for many underrepresented groups to get involved. So how to solve this documentation problem? Well, humans have to write documentation and 60% of those open source contributors never did. But at least one can help a bit by looking at projects where documentation is really well done. I mean, there's some really, really well documented open source projects. So why not use their documentation and derive documentation for other people's code? Right? There's a metrics, it's called the Bleu score, with which you can find out whether documentation is concise. And if you have then all those nice examples of good documentation and not so good documentation, you can take that and derive documentation for code even if it does not have one, based on other projects' examples. And this entire experiment, how this can be done, has been open sourced on GitHub. So if you want to build your own documentation generation thing or want to learn how this is done, it's all open sourced. And this is also the foundation of our semantic search, right? So we launched this experiment where you can ask with natural language and find examples of what you actually like to see. And I want to do a really short live demo on that one. Let's imagine we have my daughter who now wants to start programming. And she wants to modify this AutoCAD generator. And she wants to calculate the size of a picture, right? Then she could just type this calculate size of a picture in natural language into GitHub. And you see results of projects who just do that, although they don't mention the term picture at all, right? But it still found that because it was derived from other projects, so that those samples showed up. So I think this is pretty cool, and it's available for everybody. It's part of this experiments.github.com website. I hope those have been some examples to show that it's really not about getting rid of programmers, right? It's about adding additional tools to give you guys and girls superpowers. So at this point, you basically know that the chance that you will get replaced by a computer are literally zero, which is awesome. At the other hand, I still want to motivate you while I have you there to look into those kind of automations. I started with this quote from Victor Hugo: "Nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come." I like to use another quote, this time from Steve Jobs. He once convinced the CEO of Pepsi Cola, right, the beverage company, to switch to Apple. And he asked this Pepsi Cola CEO, "Do you like to spend your entire career selling brown sugared water, Pepsi Cola, or do you like to change the world?" And I like to ask you guys, do you like to spend your entire programming career basically rewriting code that somebody else already wrote? Rewriting the same security and performance mistake again and again, maybe in different languages, but basically repeating stuff? Or do you like to use robots to make sure that those errors don't happen to you and that you can focus on what is important? As I said, the likelihood that any programmer will be replaced by a robot is literally zero. However, that a programmer that doesn't learn about those kind of technologies will get replaced by somebody else who knows better how to use AI, this one is real. I do realize that within this talk I probably made many projections and many controversial statements, right? And if many of those things never happen, that's okay, because it's really tough to predict the future. I hope that at least I convinced some of you that the future of software has to be different, and it will be different, no matter what. Different does not always mean that it's better, right? But if you want to have anything better, it has to be different. And how this different looks like is basically up to you, right? Whether we are going in a dystopy on the left-hand side, or whether we're actually in a world where computers can help us to just build better software. GitHub likes to support you on that journey. We provide you this open source security data set you can use, for instance, to make your Docker applications more secure. We provide you with this blog which shows how we derive documentation automatically. If you are interested in using those bots like the Welcome bot or the Sentiment bot for your community, just do so. If you want to build your own robot, that's cool too. And at one of those conferences where I had discussions afterwards, somebody came to me and said, "I have this awesome idea for a robot. But you know what, Johannes, I'm a bit afraid. If this robot really becomes largely successful and hundreds of thousands of programmers are using it, who pays the bill that I host all of that thing?" I mean, it's big neural networks. And there's good news there as well. Any Probot application can be hosted on GitHub with GitHub paying the bill as part of GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions is not just about hosting Probot application, it's basically function as a service hosted by GitHub, as long as it fits into an orchestration of Docker containers. And my colleague Bas will have a talk tomorrow dedicated to GitHub Actions, 45 minutes, just on this very topic. So I'm really looking forward to that talk. And I'm also very much looking forward to the next 5 years, and looking forward to what kind of automations or robots you will come up with to give us even more superpowers. Thank you.